Welcome to the Founders of Web3 series by Outlier Ventures and me, your host, Jamie Burke. Together we're going to meet the entrepreneurs, their backers and the leading policymakers that are shaping Web3. Together we're going to try to define what is Web3, explore its nuances and understand the mission and purpose that drive its founders. If you enjoy what you hear, please do subscribe, rate and share your feedback to help us reach as many people as possible with the important mission that is Web3. I'm happy to welcome Peteris Zilgalvis onto the podcast. I'm lucky to be able to say that I've known you for some time now. I think the last time I saw you in person was in Dubai, back in the days when you could freely travel the world. Looking forward to hopefully meeting again in person at some point, but it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
So by way of introduction, there's quite a lot to pack in. So I'll probably need at least 5 minutes to read out all the titles. But Head of Unit for Digital Innovation and Blockchain, the and blockchain bit was added in the last year. Digital Single Markets, this is Head of Unit Digital Single Market, DG Connect, co-chair or one half of the chair for the FinTech Task Force. You are Latvian born and originally trained as a barrister in California, but you also spent time as a visiting fellow in Oxford and the World Bank. So you have a unique blend of kind of political science, law, capital markets. Did I get everything right there?
I think so. Sounds good.
Okay, all right. So I've known you in the context of being, one of the more progressive and kind of open civil servants within Europe generally and within the European Commission, both to kind of talk to on a private level, but then also, seeing you at conferences on stage and in social media and Twitter. So I guess that's why you've earned the additional plus blockchain in your title over the last year. Did you ask for that, by the way, or was it just given to you because you were de facto leader in the blockchain space?
Well, within the European Commission, we obviously have different policy areas and we have different areas of expertise. And so, for instance, in blockchain, we have the colleagues who are in charge of the programming, the implementation of ICT and the so-called DG Digit. We have colleagues in the research part who do blue sky and applied research in blockchain. People in, for instance, the transport area apply blockchain to transport. But where I am, we are the leaders in overall blockchain policy and we're the coordinators. I'm also the chair of a competence network that we have across the EU Commission on blockchain. So making sure that what we do, we have a unified line to the outside world. I mean, we can have a lot of debates and experimentation internally, and that we don't confuse or give mixed signals to the outside. So this is why the blockchain policy is with me, though, this is drawing on all the competence in other parts of the European Commission and obviously in collaboration with the member states.
Right. And so one of the things, as you know, this series is Founders of Web3. So we're primarily speaking to entrepreneurs and, of course, some of the investors that back them in those early days. But the reason why I wanted you on is because I think it's important to also look at startups as a form of innovation and that interplay with regulators. And obviously, regulation has been, rightly or wrongly, or to what degree, the constraining factor in blockchain and crypto. And so I think it's really important, if you are an aspiring entrepreneur in this domain, that you understand the perspective of regulators. And I think because I've had the good fortune of having slightly more direct relationships with a number of different regulators and policymakers, I also have found that there's a lot of misunderstanding or misinterpretation of any one given jurisdiction's attitude, sentiment, or approach. So, hopefully we can give a voice, a consistent a viewpoint on this space, and also kind of get your perspective on what you think a kind of healthy dynamic between the entrepreneur and the regulator is, as well as, I guess, innovation from an enterprise perspective, because of course this isn't all about just entrepreneurs building things in a silo and gaining consumers. But before I go into that, I just wanted to understand, as I said, I find you very progressive in your thoughts and a good advocate. I couldn't think of a better advocate to have out there in the wild. And in a way, I think as Hester Peirce is kind of looked at as crypto mom, I would propose that you could be Europe's crypto pop. So why is that for you as an individual? Is that born from your time in California and exposure to Silicon Valley and the innovation that comes there, or is it something in your roots from the Baltics? As I said, you're from Latvia, and places like Estonia are known as world leaders in kind of thinking about crypto and all the implications that has to sovereignty. So why are you doing what you do? What is the mix or the influence that kind of brings you to this role?
Well, I mean, I have to say it's unquestionably a mix, but overall the attitude of the European Commission right now is very positive towards fintech and towards blockchain. I mean, it's a pro-innovation approach. Obviously, fraud is fraud in any domain, and that doesn't mean we're happy with that. And obviously things like anti-money laundering or KYC in the fintech area with blockchain need to be applied, but ideally in not a burdensome way. Now I have a new commissioner that I'm directly working for, Thierry Breton, but who's French, and France is another country that has a very progressive attitude towards central bank digital currencies right now. You see the experimentation they've launched on that. But the other commissioner responsible, Vice President Dombrovskis from Latvia, from my country, who has and underlines a pro-innovation approach to this is Latvian. So you see the Baltic link. We work a lot within the European Commission, and I'm also going back to my time in the Latvian civil service with the Estonian neighbors. Thomas Hendrik Ilves, the former president of Estonia, who's active, I mean, even now in the global hack, for instance, which my unit in Startup Europe is supporting on the coronavirus, is there. And then, I mean, obviously, on all of us, or I mean, particularly on me, I spent a lot of years in California, UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, where I got my bachelor's degree, my first degree before my law doctor degree, doctor of law degree, was, the place that the first email went from to Stanford Research Institutes. I mean, I've seen the Internet Museum there, and it gives away my age, and had programming on punch cards, even though I was a political science major at that time. So, I mean, I think it's a mix, but I would say it's definitely the attitude of the European Commission that is open, is pro-innovation. I'm flattered to hear that I'm maybe one of the people most exhibiting this kind of attitude. But I think an openness to the technology is something that we have to have, and more than an openness, I mean, to really move forward with both the vision for it, with the investment, the money, and also a regulatory framework that fits. And then I would just perhaps finish by saying that though it's still sometimes the image of if it moves regulated, I mean, we've been looking closely at blockchain, not perhaps the very beginning, but at least 2012, 2013. And then it was, along with fintech, one of my major focuses when I went for a year to be a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford at St. Antony's College. And we have not moved to regulation until now. We've just closed the digital assets public consultation, and now are looking, obviously subject to what the political leadership decides, but to see whether a directive or regulation is required on, you could say the investment tokens, payment tokens, utility tokens. I mean, this is going a little bit ahead of myself. We haven't made such final classifications yet. But I mean, on these questions, whether we need to align and perhaps have a legal framework. So we've really been letting the market work, seeing where there's problems, coming probably to the conclusion, as a lot of people have, that there's a need for more legal clarity, but really letting the market work and letting solutions be found, or where they're not found, then only intervening to legislate.
Yeah, and I guess, this is, and this isn't just unique to Europe. I guess where a regulator has, in their minds, been fairly permissive by just letting the market do its thing, within that, has often created a kind of a vacuum where there is perhaps a lack of clarity. And often I think that's been interpreted as negatively, rather than, as you say, it being perceived as pro-innovation, the idea that you're kind of letting the market form, observing, to develop a better understanding about where it might be appropriate to legislate. So it would be good, maybe before we drill down into some of these specific initiatives that you mentioned, to help people understand in a European context anyway, to what extent are these decisions made and definitions made at a European level versus a nation state level. As you say, France has certainly been saying all the right things, but that often is seen to be very different to, say, Portugal, which I think has done some interesting initiatives around more from a taxation perspective, versus the UK versus Germany. So could you just explain very simply how that works, and then we could perhaps get into the meat of some of the legislation itself?
Again, very simply, we have a treaty that the member states have chosen to pool their sovereignty in several areas, not all the areas. And one of the areas that's a major driver for European integration is the internal market. And in this case, if things are just flowing across borders historically, fine, there hasn't been a need to regulate. If things have been stopped across borders, and then you go into the jurisprudence, I mean, you have cases like Cassis de Dijon, where a type of alcohol was being stopped at the border because it didn't have a percentage, and instead of saying it needs to be labeled, it was just being stopped. So you had cases and this legislation enacted to say, well, if this is beer in France, then this is beer also in Germany, a famous case, German beer related to that. So in the areas of the financial markets, this has been one of the areas where we have had some of the best successes for our startups, the so-called unicorns, let's say in payments, with TransferWise, Klarna, others. Partially, this has been due that we have the passporting on payments across borders. Also have payment services directive 2 giving access to also some of the banking data that's relevant, which is the first kind of pro-competition item of legislation in this area. So the union ensures that goods, services, capital can move across borders. This is kind of another area where we're going to go to what's called an impact assessment, which is internally where we justify that something needs to be done before we do it. It's not just people, even when we decide with the political hierarchy that we should do something, that we just do it and it just happens. You have to show the justifications. And so in this case, for instance, we would be looking at whether the lack of legal clarity is impeding a business utilizing digital assets working across borders in the 27 countries because of different definitions, different ways of registering what is a security, what isn't, what is the payment token, what kind of payment regulation they come under or not. The same for the utility tokens. Is just something under e-commerce, or is it also a security? So this is a little bit the way that it works. And then finally, something it's always good to underline, though the civil servants do the analysis and, a lot of the drafting, it's the political leadership who are politicians who take the decision whether to move with such a legislative proposal or not. So these are the commissioners and the vice presidents and president.
And so this is where, I guess this is where the digital single market comes in terms of your function. So you're looking at a properly functioning, flowing market in the digital context. And whilst you have the fintech component to your work, one of the things that I've been really impressed by, both in terms of conversations I've had with you, but then also in the communications and activity at the European level, is understanding blockchain and digital assets beyond just financial services and fintech. So around data and data sovereignty and self-sovereignty. So it'd be great to understand a little bit more about that kind of slightly more expansive understanding, because honestly, I mean, I've not seen that in any other jurisdiction. I've not seen it in the US. I've not seen it necessarily in parts of Asia. So it'd be good to understand a little bit more about that.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, that's a little bit in the design of the way that we set up our structure. As I said, I'm in a part of the commission that's responsible for the digital single market. Obviously, I mean, if you go back historically in ICT, the first mover in a lot of areas, not just with blockchain and so on, in adopting ICT has been the financial sector. I mean, going back to the 90s, the 80s, even earlier. So, I mean, the history of our Directorate General has been involved with the financial industry as a first mover, but we're responsible for ICT policy, for digital policy across all sectors. We're not the programmers, but the policy people, the economists, lawyers, and some engineers and programmers to keep us down to earth in the actual practicalities of things. And then we've combined in the FinTech Task Force with a co-chair coming from financial services. So they have a focus in their mandate and their job more on applying these emerging technologies to the financial services. But then we have research, transport, environment, climate change, and others in there as well, obviously in a little bit less active position because this isn't a daily thing for them. So as part of my job, I mean, I started with, obviously started with the blockchain. I mean, the Bitcoin at the very beginning. So I mean, this is a financial or a cryptocurrency focus. But then very quickly we started thinking on the digital single market side. But how can this be applied to other things? Is this a useful technology? I mean, this is also with AI, decentralized AI, IoT, et cetera. How can this be applied across sectors? How can this be interesting for supply chain? How can it be interesting for data management? So that's why I and we have this perspective. And I mean, I can also say very frankly, talking to people like you and others in the ecosystem, it's also inspiring. And I try to read a lot and talk to people a lot and see what the entrepreneurs, what the investors, what also public sector innovators are doing across the union and across the world.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, we've been big advocates of what we called convergence for several years now. The idea that, if you're looking at trying to understand the implications of blockchain, you need to look at it in combination with IoT and AI, really kind of forming this new data market. And so it was really interesting to see the announcement. I'm trying to think, was it towards the end of last year that the IEF was making available, I think it was 100 million euros as a cornerstone in a $400 million euro fund specifically for blockchain and AI.
Exactly. And that was developed by my unit along with colleagues primarily responsible for AI. And it was exactly in this same philosophy that we see those two technologies, and as you mentioned, also with IoT and possibly other emerging technologies coming together, both having a need for the data, for instance, AI, but also being able to process data for societal challenges, the one we have right now on a pandemic, but also the climate and others. And we see them coming together both as an investment need in Europe, but also as something that should be looked at, not always, because of course AI has aspects that go beyond the interaction with blockchain or IoT, but often should be looked at together and making sure that the legal frameworks we develop where necessary, I mentioned that we don't rush into things, but that these are also future-proofed. And so we don't have a situation where we develop something that sounds good to today and we rush in and then a year later or 2 years later, it's obsolete. I mean, this is something we were, as I said, following the blockchain area, for instance, for years and years. You had things like the bit license in New York, which probably wasn't a good move. I think almost everybody agrees today. So sometimes being a first mover, especially in legislation, is not smart. It's good to watch and work with the market, but at the same time, for a civil service, a major civil service, it's good to try to shape the market to make sure that it does have the societal needs like the climate, like now pandemics, which I think many of us would say probably we were not aware of enough, though it was always in a lot of risk analysis frameworks. So that's a little bit of our role.
Yeah, and I think that's what's been really interesting to see how Europe has been a leader looking at blockchain in the context of impact as well. So, beyond that capital market component. So, one of the ways I advocate for the approach taken within Europe, and by the way, I still class myself as a European, even if it might be denied of me from a citizen's perspective. Philosophically, I'm a European, and of course, our business operates across Europe, although we're headquartered out of the UK. But one of the things I've always advocated for in Europe's approach to this space is that going beyond fintech and cryptocurrency and thinking about this as a new stack of technologies, that it offers almost a third way. So rather than it being Web3 in the context of an iteration of technologies, it could also be seen in the context of a third alternative to how the web could function and how it could be better aligned with users and citizens rather than shareholder supremacy. So, if you look at the web as it is today, it's predominantly dominated by corporations originating at least from the West Coast, driven by a very kind of strong form of libertarianism and free market fundamentalism. And then if you look at the alternative that's emerged in the East, which is kind of, so in the West, the extreme, in America, it's kind of surveillance capitalism, as it's now been termed. And in the East, you have something which isn't servicing the supremacy of the shareholder, but the state. So you have like a form of digital statism, where everything is subordinated to the state. And I've always felt that in Europe, we have a potential for a third way, which is oriented more towards the citizen user. And I don't know if that is something that is explicitly or implicitly communicated or discussed at a European level. But I mean, clearly there are other initiatives to correct some of the failings of the web around monopolies that are formed, security, privacy. So I'd be interested to know, is that kind of framing relevant, or am I just imagining it?
I think that kind of framing is very relevant. I mean, I won't be pretending to be more technical than I am, but definitely in a policy vision, it's something that we call a human-centric internet, a next-generation internet, one which in some ways coincides with the early vision, the early development of the internet, though the ARPANET came out of the Department of the Defense. Then you had NSFNet. You had actually a fairly more protocol rather than now platforms run internet. So both to have more competition for consumer choice, citizen choice, which is always good. I mean, going to Schumpeterian economics of create a destruction, that there's a certain renewal of the coterie of companies, of those there, but also to have a wider range of viewpoints, more technological experimentation. And this is where we do see the point also for development of artificial intelligence, rather than having it very much centralized, having many different networks working on a diverse set of quality data. You get away from some of the implicit biases that you just might have if the data is only English or Italian or Indian or Chinese, etc. Because I mean, different data sets, or I mean, even within a country, these might be all men or many more women or many more younger people. So we see this decentralization as something that can also drive the scientific development, the technological development, but also as possibly being a safety aspect for the artificial intelligence. Again, if it's not just centralized, that you have different models competing, that there is, again, not a domination, that if you do get a bad AI. I mean, I'm probably quite over vulgarizing it now, but that you would have others that are run more ethically or on unbiased data and so on, but also having cooperation with them. So a little bit, that's the policy vision, that it's centered for the individual. Obviously, we have platforms, we'll have platforms, welcome platforms, but also this protocol vision, that there's a part of that that allows more new entrants. Also, as the startups people, obviously, we should be trying to make sure that new startups can still enter the market, that they can have access to data, which is a question again here, ensuring that there's not a barrier to entry on access to data that doesn't allow new business models, which might satisfy the consumer better or might be more apt to finding a solution for a climate challenge or now a pandemic challenge. So this is the philosophy and the driver behind what we do.
Yeah, and I think that's the beautiful thing about this connection with blockchain and AI, because the problem that an AI startup has is that it can't access data. Therefore, there is a barrier for it to enter the market, and that then leads to this over-centralization, over-monopolization within that competency. And so I think it's great to hear, you guys making that connection. So, the way that I look at crypto assets or digital commodities, I increasingly like to refer to them as digital commodities. Actually, if you're taking that protocol perspective versus platform perspective, how can you have something that can coordinate this new digital infrastructure? And, for me, I think looking at these things as coordination mechanisms, incentive mechanisms to allow for this bootstrapping of a bottom-up alternative, when paired with kind of a top-down, slightly interventionist approach in trying to break up or constrain platforms, I think as a bias promises to yield the most results. And again, not something I could imagine happening anywhere else in the world.
I shouldn't say we're trying to break up and restrain platforms. We'd just be happy to see more competition. And exactly as you say, if you're responsible for startups policy, you see that startups in the AI area, for instance, the access to data question is one. You have a lot of issues dealing with real implementation of privacy or real implementation, for instance, of the General Data Protection Regulation, where you have a data portability article, but which hasn't really been functioning and hasn't allowed real-time models of people being able to move their data. For instance, again, I think all of us are preoccupied with the pandemic, but also with the climate challenge, which is one we shouldn't forget, or simply to get a better service. So this is where very much we see that both the AI could provide processing and a better result with the data, but blockchain or other decentralized methods could allow more control by the citizen and the consumer, which could be both good for the marketplace, but also good for people in general, because they can realize their autonomy better, get a better service, have more choice, but something that has to always be underlined, that it has to be easy for the individual. It can't be people having to read tens of pages of terms and conditions and going into many places and settings and checking them every day, which is a little bit the conundrum you get today, that people say, well, nobody cares about privacy, but then to actually try to control it, it is so burdensome and difficult to do. I mean, with the tools that the marketplace has provided, that this is really waiting for something like a smart contract for an ecosystem where people can control what is done with data on their individual instruments or, in other parts of their lives. So this is something we see very interesting from a market perspective and also from a policy perspective. So
I've seen you've been doing a lot of work around self-sovereign identity and SSI, and obviously there is a kind of linkage there between GDPR. Some people are struggling to understand how you can have certain things happen in a decentralized manner versus a centralized manner around data in the context of GDPR, and perhaps that GDPR was designed at a time that couldn't take into account blockchains. I don't know if you have a perspective on that. I think But maybe just to close off, I really like this portability piece, because I think, for me, when we're talking about Web3, the building blocks for that is what I'd call sovereign software, something that restores, maintains the sovereignty of the user citizen, or extends it, actually. But that all starts with that portability, the idea that if I can take control of my identity and then its associated assets, starting with data, but that could be anything, any other digital asset, and I can easily move it around, that fundamentally breaks the model of today's web and many of the things that we don't necessarily like to see in it.
And I can only agree with you. And this is why in the European blockchain services infrastructure, which is something that the 29 European countries are building together, and which is going to start really launching this year, not piloting, but I think with the audit documents publication, it'll launch this year. One of the other use cases, which probably won't launch full rollout this year because it's more complicated, is a self-sovereign identity. And it really is the key to users' digital autonomy, self-determination, management of the data. And so it's something we see is necessary. And also to have a conception of identity, which is probably more appropriate for the times we live in. This is not simply, this is me, so I have the right to register for this public service, as you do with, or to cross a border. But this is me in a broad sense. This is my CV. This is my sporting experiences or climate footprint, other things that I need to bring together. Health records, again, very relevant today. So, there's full agreement on this, that this is the key. And ideally, it also fits with our philosophy of empowering the individual, which is also a very much a fundamental part of EU law that already since the times of some of the most famous court cases, Van Gen and Luz and others, the individual was able to go and enforce the EU law in his or her national courts. And this was the second level of enforcement. So, it's also philosophically built into the system. And then you mentioned GDPR, which, it is, I would say, a challenge for us, because it was, and this is us, the whole community, as well as the policymakers, because it was adopted during a time where more people were looking about the platforms and the siloed sources of data. But I think it's too pessimistic to look at the law as not being able, especially where it's principle-based law, to progress and be applied to new paradigms. So in these areas, we had a report of the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum, which is also a think tank working for us and for our unit, which has a lot of interesting reports and workshops online, which people can look into. But we had one on GDPR, and there they were saying, there's not a blockchain that is or is not GDPR compliant as such, just as there's a platform that's not by its nature GDPR compliant. It's the applications running on it, what is done with the data, what kinds of data. So, we're very much convinced that you can have a GDPR compliant blockchain in terms of implementing the principles. It's a little bit difficult, but this has happened in the past when, there was a move from horses to cars. Now we'll move to electric cars. We'll move to autonomous cars, which require perhaps some changes in the legislation, but it's never been the case that all the legislation in the countries, or, as we move into modern times, the European level has had to be thrown out. So the law can progress. It's also the role of the courts, more creatively open in the common law countries than in the civil law countries, but there still is an interpretation aspect.
Yeah, so that's interesting in that it can accommodate new paradigms. And of course, technology is only going to accelerate as it comes to us. So its ability to evolve, and as you say, in some instances, interpret intent a little bit more strongly than exactly any one particular implementation. And what is the current thinking around DAOs, Decentralized Autonomous Organization? So this is an area which, to be honest with you, I stopped thinking about for some time. It's always felt too distant and slightly introspective. You know, it's a thing that only people in crypto think that they need. But increasingly, it's caught my attention again. I've been revisiting the technology stacks that have now been built, and also some efforts to marry what happens on chain with or embed or bridge into some jurisdictions. So I think recently there was something called a LAO, which was a Wyoming-based, as far as I can remember, entity. So, you know, is this on the radar at the moment? I mean, you've got a lot on. Is it something that's being actively explored? You know, the idea that there could be an entity that exists on chain where people can presumably pool value. I don't want to say assets necessarily, but value could be data. They could own that data, and they could, or that value, and they could set the terms for its usage. Is this something that's deemed relevant now?
Well, no, it's something we've been following since the first DAO, and like with other things in the blockchain, in the decentralized digital area, we haven't seen the need to rush in. I think the first problem with the first famous DAO was also something that I think was interesting for all of us to learn from. We have a positive attitude to them. Again, innovation. Along with the, maybe just semi-decentralized multi-level EU governance blockchain that I mentioned, the EU blockchain services infrastructure. We're also interested in enabling the very decentralized at individual level blockchains in Europe, so they can take off, and that it's an area that can be an area of European innovation. In the case of the DAOs, it's been seen again as being too early to rush in and put a legal framework on it. And in fact, we've had a lot of discussion with legal experts coming from the different member states. And I mean, I don't want to pronounce because we don't have a official legal opinion, but a lot of the thinking is that, at least as a legal construct, this is not so new. It's actually something that you could say it's a partnership, which some people don't like because of the possibility of maybe unlimited liability in a partnership. Again, depending the way that it's set up. So you can also set up a partnership in other ways. So
interestingly, we are set up as a partnership at Outlier. So this is why we have an affinity towards the DAO.
Yeah, so I mean, also, so you do have a lot of thinking, and these are people who are familiar with the technology. I mean, legal experts who we talk to, that, okay, I mean, this is simply a partnership. I mean, maybe at some point there is something that is specific enough, and if we want to enable something specifically in the market, there could be a justification for specific legislation. But it's not a corporation, unless, again, it's set up as one, and you jump through those legal hoops. But seemingly the ones that would be just set up with a group of people who could be defined as partners, it would be a partnership. Again, not any official legal opinion, but this is the direction that a lot of the legal thinking is going in. So if people in the community think differently and think either for reasons of DAOs taking off in order to achieve such and such a industrial policy goal, you would need a specific legal personality. I mean, this is something we're always open to hear. And of course, it has to be justified. As I mentioned, with the digital assets, we have to go through something that's called an impact assessment. We have to show that this really is a problem, that these things are not able to take off across borders in Europe because of such and such impediments. So there we're at definitely a time where thinking about it, it's positive thoughts towards this type of body of a DAO, but there is not a move to legislate on this yet. And if this may be taken as positive or negative, depending on where the listener is.
Well, I mean, I think people will just be reassured that you're thinking about it. You have been thinking about it for a long time. And, as you said at the very beginning, this idea that you are pro-innovation. So look, I mean, I could talk to you for hours. Hopefully I will get to see you again in person at some point soon. Maybe I'll get you back on again later in the year. But it was great to chat to you again. Thank you for all the good work you're doing there. And I'm going to try and get crypto pop trending on Twitter after this podcast goes out.
Well, I don't want to overlap with Christian Carlo, I guess, is crypto dad. So, but I guess crypto pop would be still open.
Okay, right.
So very good. Great to talk to you, Jamie, and thank you for all the great work you're doing.
And you. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and share your feedback to help us reach as many people as possible with the important mission of Web3.